Repetition actually allows nerve cells to fire and wire together. If learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. And some of the research shows that if you just take people and you have them concentrate on one topic for about an hour study, that at the end of that hour, they'll double the number of connections in their brain just from their interaction with that information. But if they don't review it, if they don't repeat it, if they don't think about it, those circuits prune apart within hours or days. So if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. And for me, I just know that when I'm in an audience, I want to make learning fun. I want to make it fresh. I want to mix science with examples. I want to come at it as many ways as I can. But when people start to understand the concept, I think it's so important for them then to turn to the person next to them and explain it. Because if they can't explain that model of understanding, then it's not wired in their brain. But if they can explain it, they're beginning to install the neurological hardware in their brain in preparation for an experience. So then when they have the experience, when they apply that philosophy, that theory, that knowledge, and they get their behaviors to match their intentions, experience enriches those philosophical, theoretical circuits in the brain. And then all of a sudden, the experience causes the brain to make a chemical, and that's called a feeling or an emotion. Now we're teaching our body chemically to understand what our mind is intellectually understood. So knowledge is for the mind and experience is for the body. And in that moment, the person's beginning to embody the truth of that philosophy. And so repetition then allows them to understand what they're doing and why. And if you understand the what and the why, the how gets easier because you can assign meaning to what you're doing. And when you assign meaning to what you're doing, you have more intention behind what you're doing. So I like to do it so that nothing is left to conjecture, nothing is left to dogma, nothing is left to superstition. You understand what you're doing and why, and I think science is the language to do that. You know, your brain's job is to create meaning and coherence between what's going on in your outer world and what's going on in your inner world. And because our senses plug us into the environment, everything you're seeing and hearing and smelling and feeling and tasting, all that information has to be integrated by the brain, and it takes awareness to do that. So the moment we become aware that we're a body in space and time, that we are connected to an environment, and we're aware, our brainwaves go into what's called beta brainwave frequency, and it's kind of a fast frequency. It's kind of when we're conscious. There's nothing wrong with beta. It's when we concentrate, it's when we learn. But when we get a little out of balance, we get a little stressed, or really stressed, the brain goes into a very, very fast arousal state, what was called high beta. And high beta is even a faster frequency, and that's when you're fearful, or when you're anxious, or you're worried, or you're angry, or aggressive, or judgmental, or resentful, or impatient, or pain, as you're in pain, or you're suffering, or even depressed. The brain tends to idle at a very fast frequency, and that's good for the short term, like if you're being chased by a predator, but it's not good for the long term. And some people get stuck in those states. So then the whole purpose of meditation is to get beyond the analytical mind. And what separates the conscious mind from the subconscious mind is the analytical mind. So it then requires then people to begin to slow their brain waves down, and they move from those beta brain waves, or the high beta brain waves, and they begin to relax, and they close their eyes, and they're no longer perceiving as much sensory information because they're not seeing anything or hearing anything, and they're playing music in the background, and they're not getting up and they're not moving around, they're not eating or tasting or smelling. The less sensory information to the brain causes the brain to move into alpha. But we're looking for a very specific type of alpha, very coherent, very organized alpha. And it turns out when you take your attention off anything material and you go from a narrow focus to an open focus, and you sense nothing material, something immaterial, energy or frequency or nothing, the act of going to an open focus or a divergent focus begins to cause the brain to start to become more integrated. It becomes more holistic. It becomes more coherent. So then if the body starts to fall asleep and the mind stays awake, now you're in theta, and that's kind of like a hypnotic state. This is when you're very suggestible to information. So our research shows that when people go into that slow state of low alpha or theta, their systems that cause repair and regeneration switch on, right? And then something quite unusual happens to a lot of our students. all of a sudden the body gets super aroused, like they connect to this field of information, this frequency, and all of a sudden their brain goes into gamma brainwave patterns. And now they're getting an arousal, but the arousal is not coming from some stressor in their outer world. The arousal is coming from the sympathetic nervous system, releasing energy back up into the brain. And so now that kind of strong rush of energy causes us to become super aware, super conscious. And now we're paying attention more to what's going on in our inner world. And that's why things like super learning and profound moments and super conscious and aware moments are connected with gamma. And it turns out we can actually induce that state now. And we actually know even the words that can even stimulate it. So I don't really subscribe to any traditional meditation, like mindfulness or any Buddhist or Hindu or any specific types of meditation. And the reason being, although there's threads of commonality in some of it, I think I use just the scientific model, because I think that once you start talking about tradition or culture or religion, if you're addressing an audience, you will divide an audience. But I think that science creates community and it unifies people, and it is the language. So I use different types of meditation based on the research that we've done to not only to become conscious and present, which is important, and to become aware of your thoughts and notice them and not participate in them, and overcome some emotional states. I understand that. But I also believe that we're creators, that once you get to this place of inner peace and present moment, now it's time to start directing energy. And the only way you direct energy is with consciousness, with your intent, with your mind. And so then energy follows your mind, or follows your thought, follows your intent. And that's when people start beginning to make measurable changes in their bodies or in their lives, in any direction they want to go. So we teach people how to then not only just become mindful, but also to begin to create the lives they want. Well, we teach the blessing of the energy centers because each one of those energy centers are centers of information. They have their own frequency, they have their own energy, they carry their own message, their own intent, they have their own consciousness, their own glands, their own hormones, their own chemicals, and their own individual little brains. And so they're under the control of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the automatic nervous system that regulates hormones and digests food and makes enzymes and transports nutrients. I mean, this is that system that's giving us life. And so the only way you can actually connect to that operating system is by changing your brain waves. And so in reality, the nature of reality is both particle and wave. It's both matter and energy. And so we've just been habituated into focusing on matter. That's just where most of our attention goes. So when people begin to rest their attention in these individual energy centers, and they're in that proper brainwave state, and then they can tune into the energy of each one, convergent and divergent focus. And if they can just tune into that frequency and stay present with it, that individual little brain will begin to become as coherent as our big brain when we open our focus and do the same thing. And so people begin to program their autonomic nervous system, and their bodies get more balanced and get more healthy, and they start repairing and regenerating, and their hormone levels go back to normal, and their imbalances begin to become more balanced. And it's a very simple process, but it's taken a little bit of time for students to finally understand what they're doing and why they're doing it that way. But yeah, it's the most popular meditation amongst our advanced community. Well, I mean, there's different breaths for different reasons, but the breath that we do is the breath as we use the body as an instrument of consciousness to begin to draw energy from those lower centers back up into the brain. So imagine the majority of people's thoughts are connected to their first three centers in their body. And those centers have everything to do with survival, sexuality, pain, suffering, victimization, guilt, shame, anger, control, self-importance, fear, aggression. And most people think certain thoughts that turn on certain circuits in their brain. They feel certain emotions. The moment they feel certain emotions, those emotions signal hormonal centers, and then the moment we feel a certain emotion, we think more corresponding thoughts equal to how we're feeling. And the repetition of that cycle conditions the body emotionally become the mind. So we're taking thought in the form of energy and storing it in the body, and now the body becomes the mind of that emotion.